Welcome everyone to our winding down of the study of Genesis. We're in chapter 47 today out of 50. I realize that for some of you it seems longer than that. Yes.
I tell you, it really came to me throughout these studies in Genesis that right from the beginning, what liars we are.
Why are you looking directly at me when you say that?
Well, then I go back to, I look even at myself, you know, what do I do even on Sunday morning? I put on the happy face.
Well, I've noticed that some of the biggest lies that I have told, and those that have had some of the most long-lasting effect, is when I was simply trying to put a good face on something. But, you know, we call it our best foot forward. Mm-hmm. That generally is a lie. Because I think it's Paul that tells us there's really nothing good about it. And when that realization begins to materialize in how we conduct ourselves, it does lead to a more truthful life. But yeah, we tend to tell lies easily, decoratively, and faster than a horse can trot, depending on the situation. Any thoughts, comments, problems from last week? Dumped off a lot last week. Oh dear. Drove every nail home, did I? Where that was. Frank is shaking his head. Oh, come on. There.
Yeah, it's always kind of amazed me how the Pharaoh got in power in Egypt anyway. Because he wasn't an Egyptian.
How did he what?
How did he get to be Pharaoh if he wasn't an Egyptian?
He came with a really large army.
That's the only thing I could think of too, but
Upper
it doesn't mention it.
Yeah, Upper and Lower Egypt, which, depending on what time of their history you're looking at, will be one country or two. And when they were two, they tended to fight a lot between themselves. And what the Hyksos did is they waited until they had expended their money and their men and pretty much their willpower on battling each other, and they came down and they took everything over. What they had was the military. They left the administrative people pretty much in charge, Egyptians. And that's why you'll see this careful mention as we're looking at Joseph's story about what Pharaoh's doing, what the Egyptians' response is, and what Pharaoh's household is, because those are all totally different things. Now we're going to see in the 47th chapter smart politics, smart theology, smart sociology. And what Joseph does, because Joseph is actually the one who's not Egyptian either, is the one who comes down and then binds the Egyptian populace to Pharaoh, not to the Egyptians, to him personally. That's Joseph, one of the things that he does. We'll see that. But as we get into that,
politics, theology, and
Sociology.
sociology, social behavior. Let's start this morning not looking at Genesis 47, but let's turn to 1 Peter 2:17. Read 4 verses. 1 Peter 2:17 to 20. Honor all men. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the king. There's your smart theology and smart politics right there. Servants, be subject to your master with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward. For this is thankworthy, if a man for conscience toward God endure grief, suffering wrongfully. For what glory is it, if, when you be buffeted for your faults, you shall take it patiently? But if, when you do well and suffer for it, you take it patiently, this is acceptable to God. In these 4 verses, you see Joseph's life in Egypt in a nutshell. Remember, he's not there willingly. He comes down as a slave. And then, when things are really looking up for him, he gets thrown into jail by the guy that he didn't do anything but serve faithfully. And he is thrown in for doing just exactly what the Apostle Paul tells Timothy to do, and that is to flee, and Joseph did it physically, flee youthful lust. He's enticed by Potiphar's wife, he flees, she frames him, he ends up in jail. But for all of that, you don't see him complain, you don't see him whine, you see him treat everybody, including his fellow prisoners, with great respect. You look at the butler and the baker, you might say they're two peas in the pod, although one was guilty of, probably of plot against Pharaoh, and the other one was innocent. That's why the butler was restored and the baker was hanged, and his head cut off. But they wanted to make sure he was dead, and apparently did. But when Joseph was dealing with these two guys, you'd think that they were his best. He comes in and said, "What do you say? What's he sit down in the mouth about? He's a noticer. And he notices whether they're happy or sad. I don't know what anybody would have to be happy about in jail. But Joseph could tell the difference, and he inquired. Well, of course, there was that troubling dream that they had, each of them. And then later, he encounters another man who has had a troubling dream, and that's Pharaoh himself. And at 30 years, finally, 13 years after he's gone down there, he stands before Pharaoh as second in the kingdom. But he's still separated from his brethren. Everything that he was raised with and around, he is alien to that. Has to learn a new language. Has to learn a lot. And he does, apparently quite successfully. Then down comes his brethren. He knows them and they don't know him. See how estranged he is? And yet, when he reveals himself to them, it's a very loving, touching scene. He embraces them. He weeps upon them. Kisses them.
But that's not reciprocated. Not by the brothers.
It is by Benjamin. They weep on each other's neck. Remember, Benjamin was just a little guy when Joseph goes down to Egypt. And they're the two full brothers, daughter of Rachel. I raised Rachel's name again just to bother Linda a little bit. She's present in those boys. I will maintain that.
So her being the moon, and the prophecy that, or the dream that Joseph had of the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowing down, she bowed down because she was in her sons, and you used that illustration before, right, of Levi paying tithes while he was still in Abraham's loins.
Yes, and that's why there are in fact two dreams that Joseph has. One is of the sheaves that bow down, and then one is the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars. And so that second one cannot be fulfilled until Benjamin does come down, and he's not there on the first trip.
Right,
But he's there on the
10 on the second trip. And then so because of Benjamin and Joseph, because Rachel is in them by, what was the word,
By virtue of seed of the woman.
yeah, the seed of the woman, by Rachel in fact is bowing down also. That's in a spiritual sense, is that correct?
Yes, I believe it is.
Spiritual sense with.
And I believe we have every word of scripture to read it that way.
Okay.
Now, that dream is not interpreted verbatim in scripture.
No.
And I think that gives latitude on how one looks at it. For instance, you may look at it one way, I may look at it another. We can both be right, one of us can be right, one of us can be wrong, or we both can be wrong. But as long as it maintains the scriptural integrity of where that dream is pointing to, and it eventually will be the supremacy of Joseph and the entire family, bowing bowing down to him, and they all do. When he goes down to Goshen in that chariot, those trumpeters are out there, and they say that word, Abrak, and the Egyptians stand up and the Hebrews bow down, every one of them. But let's have a look at chapter 47, now that we've kind of broached the subject. You seem to be contemplative this morning.
No, I was just been thinking a lot about these, dreams and interpretations of the last couple weeks. Joseph just, tells it like he sees it,
Yeah,
and, you think of the cupbearer and the baker, hey, thanks for the message, as Joseph, me being, if I was Joseph, I don't want to give that message to a guy. You're gonna die. And it's not gonna be fun. They're gonna find you out, basically. What was that like? A good night's sleep for him that night? Before he got called up ahead, because he knew what was gonna happen before he got there, and yikes.
well, he is the one who asked.
Yeah, I guess.
They both.
Be careful what you ask for.
They both were.
And the same with, but then he sees these dreams of the wheat and the stars and the moon and the sun. That's kind of an exciting one until you're in the bottom of a pit,
And they're all kind
until
of
you're then thrown in jail for doing something you didn't do.
Right.
And then, all of those things, just to have the faith to stick it out.
and they say, the scripture says that his brothers hated him for his visions and his words, his dreams and his words. And yet when they get down to Egypt, they will live by his word. If it's a command that he gives, if it's a blessing that he gives, if he says it, it's gonna happen. And they live by that. And that is life. That is life. And he's the one who has been sent ahead by God to provide it. And through all of that, and if there was anybody that had an opportunity and probably every earthly reason to take revenge, it would have been Joseph. But he rejects, he knows they know they're guilty of having sold him into slavery. And he says, you meant it for evil. He doesn't say you did it. He says, you meant it. But God sent me here ahead of you to preserve your life. And that you would have a posterity. And that you not come to poverty. Every little detail has been taken care of in that plan of God. And so it's God that sent him down. So he is saying, I'm looking to the good of the hand that gave that, and I'm not even seeing the rest of this stuff. The sale for 20 pieces, the 13 years in prison.
That's the thing. You think about what throwing him in the pit, what hinges on that. The building of the wilderness tabernacle hinges on him being thrown in a pit.
Yes, it does.
The building of Solomon's temple literally hinges on him being thrown in the pit.
Yep.
That's how God finances that. That's how God
And
provides.
we're gonna see that in this chapter. Big time. Takes care of the food, takes care of the health, takes care of the distance, takes care of the fact that Jacob doesn't want to be buried in Egypt. Okay, we'll take care of that too. We're getting back up there. And
That's a horrible thing to happen, and it's so anti what you would think should happen. But it's the thing that has to happen for all the rest of this to take place.
well, it was one way of God having his plan come to fruition and having the Egyptians pay for it.
Right. He had to be thrown in jail at Potiphar's house. Because if his wife hadn't accused him, he'd probably just been number 2 at Potiphar's house for the rest of his life.
And how much of the story prophetically do you think Joseph had when he was thrown into the clink the first time? See, he suffered for well-doing. And he suffered without reproach against those who put him there. That's what Peter is telling us in that epistle.
Well, it's comforting now, we can look back at it, but going through it, in the middle of it,
If there isn't a lesson there about bearing with patience and running with
Exactly.
patience the race that is set before us.
without knowing the outcome. I mean,
And-
Joe at least had a vision that he hoped one day would come to pass.
Well, you look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over there in Daniel, and they said, look, it's gonna work out this way. Our God can save us. Now, whether he will or we won't, we don't know. And if he doesn't, we're still not worshiping your God.
Just-
And that basically is what Joseph is saying. Your husband has treated me better than anybody else that's working for him. But I wouldn't be sinning against him, I'd be sinning against God. Do you see how that really would have
That's
torn
just
her off?
amazing.
And without her anger, the rest of this doesn't come to pass. He doesn't get
All
to
those-
demonstrate the first two dream interpretation.
Right.
You wanna talk about a finely braided cord. This is
That's that tapestry illustration. Underneath it looks all messy, but then you turn it over and you see what God's doing.
And because we, unlike God, cannot remember the future. God can and does. We see the tapestry as we walk through time from the backside. We see those hanging threads. We don't see the pattern. And I don't think we're gonna see much of a pattern in what it fully reveals until we get to that far side of Jordan ourselves.
Yeah, and he knows when
Exactly.
Oh, yeah, and we'll know even as we are known. Any other comments on how we distracted the conversation last week?
It was just important for us to get that perspective. Kathy today was telling us, or sharing with me, that from God's perspective, it's past, present, and future are all now. From his perspective, his sight, his thinking, we don't see that. We're not privileged to that yet. But it's by faith that we know, by faith we know, and we live, the just shall live by faith. And so it's us living
And is in fact the very substance of what you cannot see.
that, yes, and so
And
this
that's the
whole,
hope.
Yeah.
the hope and the faith tied together with that, and then love, faith, hope, and love tied all three together in that three-chord strand of, in the lesson, I mean, the overall bigger lesson of this whole thing.
Now, Ed?
Well, it tells me, I studied that plan of redemption, and it shows me God's in control. And this is all part of the plan of redemption. This whole
Yes,
thing.
it is. Yes,
And
it is.
that
As a matter of
increases
fact,
your faith too.
and I believe it's when we get to chapter 48, now that you've mentioned redemption, is the first time that word, redeemed, is used in Scripture. Jacob said it. One beginning, many words, that's one of the words. Verse 1. Then Joseph came and told Pharaoh and said, my father, my brethren, their flocks, their herds, and all they have are come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen. And he took some of his brethren, even 5 men, and presented them unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto his brethren, what is your occupation? And they said unto Pharaoh, thy servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers. They said moreover unto Pharaoh, for to sojourn in the land are we come. For thy servants have no pasture for their flocks. For the famine is sore in the land of Canaan. Now therefore we pray thee, let thy servants dwell in the land of Goshen. And Pharaoh spake unto Joseph, saying, thy father and thy brethren are come unto thee. The land of Egypt is before thee, in the best of the land make thy father and brethren to dwell. In the land of Goshen let them dwell, and if thou knowest any men of activity, that would be men, competent men, among them, then make them rulers over my cattle. And Joseph brought in Jacob his father, and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Jacob, how old art thou? And Jacob said unto Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have the days of the years of my life been, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh. And Joseph placed his father and his brethren and gave them possession of the land of Egypt and the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph nourished his father and his brethren and all his father's household with bread according to their families. Now I want to stop there at the bottom of the 12th verse and have a look at a few of the things that are beginning to show their heads and their faces as we're going along. First, he informs Pharaoh that his family has arrived. He doesn't just come trotting them in. He informs them. Then he brings 5 of his brethren. Pharaoh might have been a little overwhelmed if he brought in all 11, so he brings in 5. Now Pharaoh already has a bit of a history with Joseph, and he knows that anything that Joseph touches blooms big time. Tell you what, why don't you look out somebody in your family, and while they're down there in Goshen looking after their flocks, they can look after mine too. Notice that Pharaoh has cattle. He's not an Egyptian. Egyptians hate herders. And they hate anybody who has anything to do with cattle. Now then, Joseph brings Jacob in. Now it says that he presents his brothers to Pharaoh. This is very formal. This is recognizing the hierarchy. He's presenting the lesser to the greater. It doesn't say that he presents his father to Pharaoh. It says he stands him before him. And look what happens. Jacob blesses Pharaoh. Not the other way around. Now, I believe it's Hebrews 7:7. When we have a look at what happens when these sorts of things happen, these blessings. And this is the story of what Abraham, remember Abraham back earlier in the book? And without all, he that was a descent is not counted, in verse 6, but he whose descent is not counted from them received tithes if Abraham blessed him that had the promise. And without all contradiction, the less is blessed of the greater. Who blessed who in chapter 47? Who wrote the book?
Moses?
Yes, but whose word is it?
God.
Now, God has just made the determination between these two guys who's greater, and it's not Pharaoh. As great as he was, and as honored as he was, and as an instrument of blessing as he was to Abraham's seed, Jacob is the seed. And the word is, I will bless him that blesses you, and I'll curse him that curses you. Now you will not see this. This is really going to flower here. Verse 13. Oh, before, here's something I want to point out. Verse 11. And Joseph placed his father and his brethren and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt. Do you see that word possession? Now, how long have they been wandering around, sojourners and strangers in Canaan? And the only land that they own is the cave at Machpelah, a cemetery,
Right.
and the shoulder of a hillside in Shechem. That's it. Just enough for Jacob to have built a house. They don't own anything. Here they get down to Egypt and they say to Pharaoh, we would like to sojourn, we'd like to stay for a while. And they get a possession. This is real property. Leaps and bounds description, as we say. They've never had that before. They've got it here. And there was no bread, verse 13, in all the land, for the famine was very sore. So that the land of Egypt and all the land of Canaan, I want you to notice that, fainted by reason of the famine, and Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan. All right, he's got the Egyptian silver and gold, and he's got the Canaanite silver and gold. For the corn which they bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So it all comes to Pharaoh, doesn't it? All right, there's the money. And watch what this does to the economy. And when the money failed, now that doesn't mean that, as we would say, the dollar became worthless. They just ran out of money. They had no more. They'd already spent every cent they had in terms of weighted silver and gold paid into the treasury of Pharaoh for grain. And when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread, for why should we die in thy presence, for the money faileth?" And Joseph said, "Give your cattle, and I will give you for your cattle, if money fail." And they brought their cattle unto Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for horses, and for the flocks, and for the cattle of the herds, and for the asses, and he fed them with bread for all their cattle. Now he's got their money, now he's got the livestock. And remember, largely supported by an agricultural society. When that year was ended, they came unto him the second year, and said unto him, "We will not hide it from my lord, how that our money is spent. My lord also has our herds of cattle. There is not aught left in the sight of my lord, but our bodies and our lands. Wherefore shall we die before thine eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread. And we and our land will be servants unto Pharaoh." Unto who?
Pharaoh.
Not the Egyptians. Unto Pharaoh.
Oh, under Pharaoh land.
Yeah. "And give us seed, that we may live and not die, for the land be, and that the land be not desolate." And Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. For the Egyptians sold every man his field, because the famine prevailed over them, so the land became Pharaoh's. Pharaoh's got the money, Pharaoh's got the livestock, now he's got the land, and a whole country full of personal servants. And he's not Egyptian.
That's interesting because you wouldn't necessarily gather that. It almost sounds like a contradiction if you didn't know the history of Pharaoh. I mean, Pharaoh should have all of Egypt. I mean, he's Pharaoh. But now he really does.
Now he really does. The absolute monarch is also an ultimate owner, with one exception. And as for the people, he removed them to cities from the one end of the borders of Egypt even unto the other. Only the land of the priests bought he not. For the priests had a portion assigned them of Pharaoh, and did eat their portion which Pharaoh gave them, wherefore they sold not their land. Now, Joseph's not cutting slack to these people just because they're priests. He is honoring what Pharaoh has already put in place. He's not going to gainsay Pharaoh. Pharaoh gave the priests that land. He also gave them a portion of his own household for food, and Joseph does not take that away from him. I want you to notice he doesn't take anything away from the Egyptian people either. They offered to buy and to sell. And he had the money to do it, and they did it. And the money was in grain. There was a time when potatoes were money in Ireland too. And this business about removing them into cities, that simply shortens the supply line during the famine. You don't have to run back and forth to the storehouse. You bring them to the storehouse. That's where the food is. Then Joseph said unto the people, "Behold, I have bought you this day and your land for Pharaoh." He doesn't hold himself out as the one having the answer. He says, "I bought you for Pharaoh. Lo, here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And it shall come to pass in the increase, that you shall give the 5th part unto Pharaoh, and 4 parts shall be your own, for seed for the field, for your food, for them and your households, and for food for your little ones." And they said, "Thou hast saved our lives. Let us find grace in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servant." And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt unto this day, that Pharaoh should have the 5th part, except the land of the priests only, which became not Pharaoh's. 20%'s a lot. And it's going to be perpetual. Let's do a modern day comparison. Those of us who live here in the land of the free and the home of the brave. We are a capitalistic society. The federal government and IRS, I don't know how it treats you, but this is how it treats me, takes 24% right off the top for income tax. 24. That's 4% above what Pharaoh got. And the state, the county, the city, and the districts haven't had a shot at me yet, but they're going to. And that'll take that 24%, depending on value and a few other things. It will run, I hate to use the word average, percentile. It'll take that 24 up to about 32%. And we haven't even talked about sales tax yet, which is, what, in Mansfield? 8 point what?
7.9.
7 point,
7.9.
okay.
7.9.
Rounded to 8% on purchases. We haven't talked about license fees, permit fees. We haven't talked about excise taxes. We haven't talked about capital gains. Look what a deal he gave them. And that was so popular with the people and with the king that it stood in place for 450 years and longer. Show me one law in this country that stood 400 years. The country's not that old. Now, in doing that, excuse me, he has placed the loyalty of the people directly at Pharaoh's feet. Pharaoh did not have that before, but he does now. Pharaoh has in his treasury all of the precious metals used for currency, used for money in Egypt and in Canaan. It's all down there. He's got all the cattle, horses, and when you're the ones that invented the chariot, I would imagine the horse would be a pretty important thing. They also invented the wheel and the axle, as I understand. And now, you have the love of the people. Look what Joseph has done for Pharaoh. And all because Pharaoh has been kind to the household of God. When God told Abraham, I'll bless him that blesses you, he meant every word of it.
Yeah.
And I think as we read through Genesis or any other book of the Bible that you happen to be studying now, he means every word of it. Does that mean I'm going to understand every word when I read it the first time, second time, third time, or even the fourth and the fifth? Not necessarily. But I will understand it in the time that he will have me understand it.
Amen.
I don't think Joseph understood why he was being thrown in that dungeon. That's where he first got to exhibit that gift of the interpretation of dreams that he got to then manifest right in front of Pharaoh to make all the rest of this happen. So I would imagine as far as Joseph and his walk, and I'm guessing he ran that race with patience that was set before him the way that we are admonished to. And look how the blessings of God come onto that man and onto anybody that's around him. I think one of the reasons, and this is just my thinking, but I think one of the reasons that the United States was originally and early on blessed is because we've always made a place for God's people.
Mm-hmm.
Whether they're Jew or Gentile, we've made a place. Now that door's closing. And it's closing rather fast. But that part was true. And you watch the blessing depart when that happens. It will go. It will have to. I'll bless him that blesses you. And remember, Abraham has two seeds. He has a physical seed, and he has a spiritual seed. Mm-hmm. And if you're baptized into Christ, then you are an heir of the promise and a child of Abraham. That's the oldest covenant. That's the oldest covenant of redemption. Noah is deliverance. Abraham is redemption. Go to a land where I'll show you. I'll take you out of idolatry. I'll bring you into the light. That's redemption.
Say
Now,
it
what
again,
does
Jay.
happen?
Noah was what?
What's that?
Say it again, Noah was what?
The Noahic covenant is deliverance.
Sure it is, yeah.
The Abrahamic covenant. And by the way, the covenant which accompanies the Noahic covenant, that token of the rainbow, that token is forever. That God never forgets what he says and he keeps every one of his promises. But the promise is that he would not destroy by flood.
What?
The promise is, I will never again destroy the earth by
Right.
flood.
Right, right, right.
that leaves a lot of options open to him. Just isn't gonna happen by water, again. That's why I say that the Noahic covenant is deliverance. Abrahamic is redemption. And the difference between the two is Noah got to ride over the flood. The Abrahamic covenant will bring you through it. I don't care how deep it is. And I'm not just talking about water. Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt to this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth part, except the land of the priests only, which became not Pharaoh's. That's verse 26, going on to 27. And Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions therein, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. Now, did you notice the word Israel? That's Jacob's name, right? But it says they. You see what's beginning to form here? A people. Not just a person. A people. Which will be the people of God. His choice. They don't even see it happening yet. But they will when they come out. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so the whole age of Jacob was 147 years. And the time drew nigh that Israel must die, and he called his son Joseph and said unto him, If now I have found grace in thy sight, put I pray thee thy hand under my thigh. Have we heard that before? That's what Abraham did with the steward, right? Sending him after sending the steward to find the wife for his son.
He was Eliezer.
The hand in my, and deal kindly and truly with me. Bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt. But I will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me out of Egypt, and bury me in their burying place. And he said, I will do as thou hast said. And he said, Swear unto me. And he sware unto him. And Israel bowed himself upon the bed's head.
It's interesting how 28 is Jacob and 29 is Israel.
You'll notice, and sometimes in the same verse, it'll interchange. But up there in 27, Israel is them. Down here it's him.
Yeah.
And then it's Jacob.
Then it's them again.
And you'll see that interchanging when, I don't know if you want to say that the one penning this narration is Moses or God himself. Moses couldn't have done it without God, and God
Right.
chose to use Moses. So if you want to say who wrote Genesis, Moses or God, the answer is yes. But when it's pointing out to you specifically that Israel is Jacob, he will use Jacob's name with Israel. When he's talking about his children, those boys, becoming a people, will be called Israel, well, his name will be named upon them, then you will see Jacob's name not used, you just see Israel. And look at verse 27. You'll see what I mean. And Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions therein. It doesn't say Jacob, does it? So you know they're talking about that people generally. So the name is beginning to become a little bit more encompassing than just prince who prevails with God. This is becoming applied to all of God's people. And Rick had a very good point. What has just occurred has financed the Exodus. And they don't know it. When they come out with all the riches of Egypt. And not only that, but those Egyptian people, which are now so glad that Pharaoh's given them grain, that they give everything to Pharaoh, they're just as glad to give it all to Israel so they'll get out. Because by the time Israel leaves, this Pharaoh who's sitting there then, who is not Hyksos, he's Egyptian, has destroyed the entire country. Simply by saying, bring on your plagues. God says, okay, fine, you get 10 of them. He destroys, look at them. They come down there because they need grain, right? What do you think the hailstorm took care of during the plague? Yeah. But the murrain of beasts, they want the livestock. They couldn't even drink the water, which is water in Goshen, for all of Israel. And finally, the last plague is death.
But we gotta remember on those plagues that it didn't touch the Israelites.
Some did, first three did.
Yeah.
Oh, I guess they did. Oh, the last one, if they did not, follow directions.
Anybody who didn't have the blood
Yeah.
up.
If follow, it would have saved they'd have saved the whole Egypt if they would have
would've.
followed.
Yeah.
But they're 400 years difference.
It's about, it's
Yeah,
450
exactly.
years difference. And the Pharaoh then is not Hyksos. So the blessing that's given to this guy, you know, when they get rid of them, and they do, they weren't there all that long as far as the Egyptian history. Egypt's got a history of over 3,000 years. And the Hyksos are there for less than 500. Just an eye blink. As far, and then of course the Egyptians went out to do everything they could to obliterate any historical record of the Hyksos. And they did a pretty good job of it. If you're going to date it by just historical record, you know, profane history, yeah, you can get within about 150 years of when it started. You can get within about 150 years of when they took the names off the pylons, they took it off the buildings, eradicated any kind of that language to get it out of there. And basically, it now said when Exodus starts, it says that when they were forced into when Israel was forced into slavery, that they built the city of Ramesses. And this is how careful they were to change things. Ramesses was a pharaoh, but he's not the pharaoh that built Ramesses. He liked what was done there, so he stuck his name on it. They did the same thing with some of the older pyramids too. Newer ones, that was a little harder to do. But they would change the history if in fact they decided they wanted credit for a military victory, economic, upturn, all that kind of stuff. Basically, what we do now. You know, if the stock market's going great, who wants to take credit for it? The president. He may or may not own any stock, but he'll take the credit for it. And if it turns down, there's a downturn, well then we'll make sure that the president gets credit for it, whether or not he's forced. Okay, that's the way. And we'll do the same thing in religion. You were mentioning earlier, about difficulty of financing, funding the work of God. Nothing is simpler in the world. I was watching a couple of ministries on the internet just this week, and basically their messages were, send your money to God, and here's the address. And of course the address changed depending on who you were listening to at the time, but that's what they were saying. One of them needed $14 million for a brand new church to replace their brand new church because Fellowship Hall wasn't big enough. That's quite a ministry. Wish I'd have thought of that myself. Fellowship Hall's a little small for my place.
Well, and the thing is, keeping with my thing this today, you're already talking about funding the Exodus, but look what has to happen for the Exodus. I mean, babies killed.
Right.
I mean, you tell a
Something
mother
bad.
who lost her baby, well, you know, this is all for God's good.
That part is true.
It's hard in the middle of
It's
it.
very hard, and we look at this terribly, overly severe God who allows all this to happen.
Yes.
All right, let me ask you a question. Now, this is going to sound cold, and it's going to sound blunt, but I'm going to ask you this question anyway. Had God restrained his hand, and that not happened, how many of them would be alive now anyway?
Exactly. Zero.
Yes,
I mean, Moses had to be put in the basket
to save you.
to save Israel.
To save Israel, right.
Yeah.
And
But that's
And
the
to
thing.
bring a fiery law.
and to be educated. He needs to be an educated man.
But it's hard
Well,
to
you
tell a
certainly
mother
are.
that.
Well, she got to nursing.
No,
But the other mothers,
How about all the mothers that lost their babies to the sword? Well,
Are you talking about Herod, or are you talking about,
6 of 1.
Pharaoh, he does the same thing.
no, he had him thrown in the river.
Oh yeah, sorry, for crocodile food.
Okay then.
But it's still harsh. That's a harsh thing. to
It's a
put
hard,
your,
it's a hard life.
it's a hard life,
And
exactly
the
right.
fact that there is death is not God's fault, it's ours. We
We
called
studied
that
it.
down upon ourselves in the garden.
Exactly.
And God has used everything, we're just like Joseph's 10 brothers. Everything we do, we mean for evil, and God will make good come out of it.
Yeah.
Because it's His plan and His purpose to redeem His own. And I do not care who you are.
You know, that's interesting, Romans 8:28, we quote it all the time,
Yeah,
but
Quote it
that
again.
doesn't mean that I'm gonna see that good in my life.
well, the way you live, you probably won't.
Exactly. The thing is, I
You heard that,
literally,
Todd?
God works all things together for good to those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. Now, you may have a horrible life, but that could just be the thing that brings God's purpose.
To fruition, right.
Who endured the cross, despising the
Exactly.
for the glory that was set before
Yeah.
Him?
He set His
And that's
eyes,
what
right?
we're- Yes, and that's what we're supposed, that's who we're supposed to be like, and that's supposed to be our example to such an extent.
That this might be in you.
Well, yes, and let that burning lamp of that spirit shine forth from you, because we're supposed to have it, supposed to have it. I see that hand.
What was talking about type as well, is that you have the Hebrew babies are getting slaughtered, and so Moses gets put in the basket that's found by one of Pharaoh's daughters, and Herod is slaughtering all the children, 2 years, boys 2 years and under, which forces Jesus to get carried to Egypt to fulfill a prophecy.
Mhm.
So
It also is to fulfill that type I'm always talking about. Because when Joseph and Mary go to Egypt, with the baby, and then come back, that the gospel tells us that that was fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy, I have called my son out of Egypt, and that was Israel brought out in the Exodus the first time when he tells Pharaoh, Egypt is my firstborn, you take your hands off or I take yours. Now, that business about the babies, whether they're thrown in or sword, they were doing everything they could to get rid of them. And hadn't been for a couple of midwives, and hadn't been for Pharaoh's daughter herself, who just simply could not tear herself away from that good-looking baby boy. I was going somewhere with that. Now, where was I? It's like this. We are told that we're not to judge because what we judge with will be judged to us. That Pharaoh said, kill the Hebrew boys.
There's what now?
Kill those Hebrew boys.
That's what the Pharaoh said.
That's what Pharaoh said. So what happens to the Egyptian firstborn? God says, out of your own mouth. Pharaoh got to choose. That's not God's choice. That's why I say we bring that down on ourselves. And if he wanted to be ignorant of how God deals, because the Abrahamic covenant was there, I'll bless him that blesses you, and I'll curse him that curses you. There is no way out of that. Either the blessing or the cursing. That's why when Moses places them in front of Israel too, when they're going in, just before they go into the promised land, he points out the two mountains. This one's blessing, this one's cursing, this one's life, this one's death. Therefore, choose life, and guess what, guys? You get to choose. And that's what the gospel gives us. It gives us a standing place under that blood to choose life. Therefore, choose life. For me, such a deal. Easy question. Because I don't have to answer it. I didn't have to provide the blood. It's there for me. It's there for you. That makes it fairly easy.
It amazes me, Joseph's faith during all this. I mean, being tossed in the well and in the dungeon, not once does he say, take this cup from me.
No, he doesn't. and is kind of the antithesis of his father, who conspires with his mother and fights with his uncle and his brother and everything else. And yet, the growth in Jacob is unmistakable. When you get to that hall of fame of faith in Hebrews, where it lists those Old Testament names and why they're there, you realize that Jacob is the only name there, and it's mentioned because he worshipped. That's not said of any of the others, but it is a Jacob. And he does it right here, in the last verse of Genesis 47. And he said, swear unto me, and he swore unto him, and Israel bowed himself upon the head bed. That's bowed, that's worship. That's what
Who's he
that is.
worshiping?
He's worshiping God. That's what that Hebrew word that is transferred bowed means. It means worship. And here's Jacob. He's at the end of his road, and he believes so strongly that he doesn't even want to be tainted by the sands of Egypt. He wants to be buried up there with Dad and Granddad. Can't say that I like. Which brings us to the end of the 47th chapter and the beginning of the 48th. The 48th and the 49th chapters are going to be very, very detailed, and I hope that when we get to those, I don't bore you with some of the detail, but we want to be careful that we look at all of them and watch these threads come together, because this is the tying together of all of those threads that we so easily scatter behind us as we think we're charting our own way through the wilderness. Questions? Further comments? Yes, I see the hand. Yeah, what do you got for us?
Well, I was just really, this lesson, this class, it just like opened up so much for me, you know, try all of these things that I try to avoid learning about. You put together the history between you and the pastor. I'm just so thankful. Now I love to read, you know, the Old Testament, and just, so much knowledge, so much history in here. So thank you so much. Appreciate this.
I have nothing to do with it.
Well, God's doing something
never
through
have.
you and the pastor here.
That's
in the
not my
class.
fault either.
Yeah.
I'm human enough, you know, to be subject to flattery, and so I thank you for your comments. But if you're seeing light, that's God's light to you. I can, you know, polish myself up pretty good and reflect a little now and then, but it's still not my light. It begins with Him. And you cannot study the book of Genesis or any other single book of this Bible without having it send you to all of the rest of the book. And if a study isn't doing that, you're not studying Scripture. You're studying somebody's idea of it, and that's a great game, whether it's mine or anybody else's. So pay attention to the Word and follow it, and the Spirit will lead you into all truth. That's His promise, not mine. Frank, would you close in prayer, please?